With the addition of emails to our photo gallery project, we're pretty much done, and hopefully by now your PHP skill set has been broadened and strengthened. Before I leave you though, I want to go over a couple of other things that I think will give you a place to go after this tutorial is over. Other things that you can try and explore on your own. And that has to do with the way that we organize our code and doing templating. The first thing I want to talk about is MVC architecture. This is a very common term in web development, and what MVC stands for is Model, View, and Controller. So I want you to be exposed to that term and know what it is, and then let's talk about whether or not we have an MVC architecture in our website and how we might get there. So let's take a look at our photo gallery project. The first of those was the M. That stands for model. Now, you may have heard me use the word model off and on instead of the word class, and that's because user, photograph, and comment are all models. They model our data for us. So they have a relationship to the database. Models don't have to, but these do, and those would all be considered models. Now we also have some other classes. It's arguable as to whether or not they'd be considered models. Maybe database object could be considered one. I think probably pagination and session would be considered helpers instead. So really the thing is that modeling our data, modeling the application. Now we could take those and put them in a folder called models. We don't have to be using the M in MVC, but that might be one of the improvements we would want to make. Group all of our models together. Now the second one of those, view, and the third one of those, controller, for V and C, let's take a look at some of our code. Let's take a look, for example, at index.php. Index.php does a lot of processing up here at the top. And then suddenly it stops and it starts outputting. And it outputs things to the end user. The top part of this is what we would refer to as the controller, and the bottom part is what we would call the view. Now typically in an MVC architecture, those would be separated into separate documents. We have not adhered to the MVC framework because we've smashed those together into one document. We've got our controller code at the top. It does any redirecting or anything like that that needs to happen. And then we do our display at the bottom. Now, as you may have noticed as we've been going through this, a lot of times what I've been doing as we refactor our code and improve it is to take things that were in the view down here and move them up into the controller so that we actually set things here. Pagination, for example. It gets set up here instead of being set anywhere down here. So we move it up into the controller. And then when we can, we also try and push things up into the model, like find by SQL. We could have written all of that out here, but we tried to push code up into the model. And that's typically what you want to do. You want to try and find things that are in each layer that can be pushed up higher into the hierarchy, from the view to the controller to the model. Now that order is different. That's MCV, or VCM, not MVC. The order of the letters doesn't matter. What I want you to understand is conceptually, as we go from the database, data comes from the database to the model, from our model to our controller, and then finally from our controller to the view that gets presented to the user. That's the downhill slope, as it were, for our data. Ideally, we'd like everything that has to do with the class, all the knowledge that we could give to the class to make our class as smart as possible, we want to be put into our classes. And we really want to be left with controller code here, controlling the way things work, or setting up things for the view. So a controller is sort of getting things organized, making any calls to models that it needs to make, so that when it's done, we're ready to render the view. And then the view is our presentation layer. And that's it. It really just focuses on these echo statements. There might be some if-then statements for checking things. There may be some loops, like for, but there's really not a lot of complicated PHP in the view. It really is about parsing through the variables that you've been given so that you can present it to the end user. So now that I've explained what MVC is, and I've told you that this violates MVC because we're combining our controller and our view, how can we separate our controller and our view? Well, one of the best ways to do that is with templates, and we'll see that in the next movie.